In his essay titled Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Foucault is concerned with the techniques of interpretation of these authors. He starts his essay by claiming that language has given birth to two kinds of suspicions. First of all, the suspicion that language does not mean exactly what it says. Secondly, language gives birth to the suspicion that there are indeed other things in the world which speak and which are not language. Perhaps there is language that articulates itself in a manner that is not verbal. Foucault believes that each culture has had its own system of interpretation and its own ways of suspecting that language means something other than what it says. Before talking about what system of interpretation the 19th century founded, Foucault talks about the 16th century. In that period, what provided a place for interpretation, both its general side and the minimal unity that interpretation had to maintain, was resemblance. Whenever things resembled each other, something wanted to be said and could be deciphered. Resemblance played an important role in the cosmology, botany, zoology, and philosophy of the 16th century. If you are interested in this idea, you should read Foucault's The Order of Things. In that book, he talks about this phenomenon in much more detail. Here, I would like to focus on the 19th century and the techniques it introduced. According to Foucault, the 19th century, and particularly Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, have put us back into the presence of a new possibility of interpretation, namely, the possibility of a hermeneutic. The first volume of Capital, texts like The Birth of Tragedy and the Genealogy of Morals and the Interpretation of Dreams, put us back into the presence of interpretive techniques. These authors presented us with what Foucault calls a perpetual place of mirrors. Not only do we, the interpreters, interpret ourselves by these techniques, but also we interrogate these same authors by these same techniques. Foucault believes that Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud have not given a new meaning to things that had no meaning. What they introduced was a new way of interpreting the world. And that's not all. Beginning with these authors, interpretation has become an infinite task. In the 16th century, signs referred to each other quite simply because resemblance can only be limited. Beginning in the 19th century, signs are linked together in an inexhaustible network, itself also infinite, not because they are based on a resemblance without borders, but because there is irreducible gaping and openness. As a result, interpretation is always incomplete for these authors. Let's just bring to mind Nietzsche's claim that facts are just what there aren't, there are only interpretations. According to Foucault, thanks to the incompleteness of interpretation, we can see everything as already interpreted. Each sign is in itself not the thing that offers itself to interpretation, but an interpretation of other signs. He claims that for Nietzsche, words themselves are nothing but interpretations. Throughout their history, they interpret before being signs, and ultimately they signify only because they are essentially nothing but interpretations. Seen under this light, words do not denote a signified, rather they impose an interpretation. The idea that interpretation precedes the sign has crucial implications. In the 16th century, the fact that things resembled each other simply proved the benevolence of God. But as Foucault tells us, in the 19th century, the sign becomes malevolent. Then no wonder that in the works of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, we see the dark side of human nature and society. Now, if interpretation is an infinite task, the role of the interpreter becomes important. The interpreter becomes the basis of interpretation, and it always matters who did the interpretation. Inspired by Foucault's insight, we could for instance argue this is the reason why Lacan always emphasized the importance of returning to Freud. If you were a physicist, you would not need to read Newton in the original Latin in order to understand Newtonian physics. Such a demand would be preposterous. However, if you claimed to be a Marxist, you would have to read Marx's work and do so preferably in German because he is the primary interpreter for what later became known as Marxism. The same goes for Freudian psychoanalysis and other similar schools of thought.